is no objection, the journal of proceedings of the trial are approved to date. No objection, so ordered. The Sergeant-at-Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent and remain in imprisonment while the Senate of the United States is sitting for the trial of the articles of impeachment exhibited by the House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Colleagues, no motions were filed this morning, so we'll proceed to the House Manager's presentation. We'll go for approximately 2 hours, then take a short recess when there is an appropriate breakdown between presenters.
Pursuant to the provisions of Senate Resolution 483, the managers for the House of Representatives have 24 hours to make the presentation of their case. The Senate will now hear you.
Mr. Chief Justice, Senators, Counsel for the President, and my fellow House managers.
What's up?
I want to begin by thanking you, Chief Justice, for
Omar, what's goody, my man?
For the way you have presided over these proceedings. And I want to thank the senators also. We went well into the morning, as you know, till I believe around 2 in the morning. And you paid attention to every word and argument you heard from both sides in this impeachment trial, and I know we are both deeply grateful for that. It was an exhausting day for us, certainly, but we have adrenaline going through our veins, and for those that are required to sit and listen, it is a much more difficult task. And of course, we know our positions. You have the added difficulty of having to weigh the facts and the law. So I want to begin today by thanking you for the conduct of the proceedings yesterday and for inviting your patience as we go forward. We have some very long days yet to come. So let us begin. When a man, unprincipled in private life, desperate in his fortune, bold in his temper, possessed of considerable talents, having the advantage of military habits, despotic in his ordinary demeanor, known to have scoffed in private at the principles of liberty, when such a man is seen to mount the hobby horse of popularity, to join in the cry of danger to liberty, to take every opportunity of embarrassing the general government and bringing it under suspicion, to flatter and fall in with all the nonsense of the zealots of the day, it may justly be suspected that his object is to throw things into confusion, that he might ride the storm and direct the whirlwind. Those words were written by Alexander Hamilton in a letter to President George Washington at the height of the Panic of 1792, a financial credit crisis that shook our young nation. Hamilton was responding to sentiments relayed to Washington as he traveled the country that America, in the face of that crisis, might descend from a Republican form of government, plunging instead into that of monarchy. The framers of the Constitution worried then, as we worry today, that a leader might come to power not to carry out the will of the people that he was elected to represent, but to pursue his own interests. They feared that a president would subvert our democracy by abusing the awesome power of his office for his own personal or political gain. And so they devised a remedy as powerful as the evil it was meant to combat: impeachment. As centuries have passed, our founders have achieved an almost mythical character. We are aware of their flaws, certainly some very painful and pronounced indeed. And yet, when it came to the drafting of a new system of government never seen before and with no guarantee it would succeed, we cannot help but be in awe of their genius, their prescience even, vindicated time and time again. Still, and maybe because of their brilliance, and the brilliance of their words, we find year after year it more difficult to imagine them as human beings. This is no less true of Alexander Hamilton, notwithstanding his recent return to celebrity. But they were human beings. They understood human frailties even as they exhibited them. They could appreciate just as we can how power can corrupt, and even as we struggle to understand how the framers might have responded to presidential misconduct of the kind and character that we are here to try, we should not imagine for one moment that they lacked basic common sense or refused to apply it ourselves. They knew what it was like to live under a despot, and they risked their lives to be free of it. They knew they were creating an enormously powerful executive, and they knew they needed to constrain it. They did not intend for the power of impeachment to be used frequently or over mere matters of policy, but they put it in the Constitution for a reason. For a man who would subvert the interests of the nation to pursue his own interests. For a man who would seek to perpetuate himself in office by inviting foreign interference and cheating in an election. For a man who would be disdainful of constitutional limit, ignoring or defeating the other branches of government and their co-equal powers. For a man who believed that the Constitution gave him the right to do anything he wanted and practiced in the art of deception. For a man who believed that he was above the law and beholden to no one. For a man, in short, who would be a king.
A king.
We are here today.
I'm a king.
In this hallowed chamber, undertaking this
solemn
action for only the third time in history because Donald J. Trump, the 45th president of the
Get
United
over
States, has acted precisely as Hamilton and his contemporaries feared. President Trump solicited foreign interference in our democratic elections,
What's up,
abusing
everybody?
the power of
How you
his
guys doing?
office to seek
Hope you all
help
are
from
well.
abroad to improve his re-election prospects at home. And when he was caught, he used the powers of that office to obstruct the investigation into his own misconduct. To implement this corrupt scheme, President Trump pressured the president of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into two discredited allegations that would benefit President Trump's 2020 presidential campaign.
True.
When the Ukrainian president did not immediately assent, President Trump
I agree with
withheld
you, Kumar.
two official
Seems
acts
like some
to induce
nonsense.
the Ukrainian leader to comply.
They just want him out of
Head of
office
state
that
meeting
bad that they'll do anything.
The Oval Office and military funding.
It's a little bit ridiculous.
Both were of great consequence to Ukraine
So I agree with you 100%.
and to our national interest and security, but one looms largest.
100%.
President Trump withheld hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid to a strategic partner at war with Russia
So did Obama.
to secure foreign help with his re-election.
And we're
In
also
other words,
looking at live
cheap.
protests in Beirut,
In this way, the president used official state
where
powers
there's been a
available
lot of
only to
stuff
him
going on, as you can tell there.
and unavailable to any political opponent to advantage
A lot of
himself in the
flashbangs
democratic
and
election.
smoke.
His scheme was undertaken for a simple but corrupt reason: to help him
Tear
win the
gas.
election in 2020. But the effect of his scheme was to undermine our free and fair elections and to put our national security
So.
at risk.
Yeah.
It was not even
That's what we're
necessary
looking
that
at.
Ukraine undertake the political investigations the president was seeking. They merely had to announce them. This is significant, for President Trump had no interest in
That's
fighting
what we're
corruption,
looking at, though.
as he would claim after he was caught. Rather, his interest was in furthering corruption by the announcement of investigations that were completely without merit.
You
The
can see all
first
that
sham
tear gas,
investigation
man.
that
There's a
President
lot.
Trump desired was into former Vice President Joe Biden, who had sought the removal of a corrupt
A lot
Ukrainian
of tear gas.
prosecutor during the previous
It is
US
hypocrisy. It's a
administration.
bunch of bullshit. I
The
don't.
Vice President acted in accordance with U.S. official policy
They just wanted
at the
to
time,
impeach him so that they could say that
and was
he's
supported
impeached,
unanimously
hoping
by
that
our
we won't
European
re-vote
allies
for him. But all this is
and
going to
key
do is
global
make people want to
financial
vote for Trump.
institutions
I
such
really
as
do
the
believe that.
International Monetary Fund that shared the concern over
There's that.
corruption.
I think it's backfiring
Despite this fact, in the course of this scheme, President
like crazy.
Trump and his agents pressed the Ukrainian president to announce an investigation into the false claim that Vice President Biden wanted the corrupt prosecutor removed from power in order to stop an investigation into Burisma Holdings, a company on whose board Biden's son Hunter sat. This allegation is simply untrue, and it has been widely debunked by Ukrainian and American experts alike. That reality mattered not to President Trump. To him, the value in promoting a negative tale about former Vice President Biden, true or false, was its usefulness to his re-election campaign. It was a smear tactic against a political opponent that President Trump apparently feared. Remarkably, but predictably, Russia too has sought to support this effort to smear Mr. Biden.
Well, he can't
Reportedly
go for
hacking into Ukrainian
2024.
energy
He
company
can only
at the
run for
center
president
of the
twice.
president's
I mean, you can only
disinformation
win the
campaign
presidency
only
twice.
last week.
So he's already president.
Russia almost certainly
They
was
can get
looking
him.
for information
He could become
related to
president
the
again in
former
2020,
Vice
stay
President's son,
reelected,
so that the
and stay
Kremlin
the president. But he
could
can't
also
be
weaponize it
president in
against
2024.
Mr. Biden, just like it did against Hillary Clinton in 2016, when Russia hacked and released emails from her presidential campaign. And President Trump has made it abundantly clear that he would like nothing more than to make use of such dirt against Mr. Biden, just as he made use of Secretary Clinton's hacked and released emails in his previous presidential campaign. Which brings us to the other sham investigation that President Trump demanded that the Ukrainian leader announce. This investigation was related to a debunked conspiracy theory alleging that Ukraine, not Russia, interfered in the 2016 presidential election. This narrative,
They both did.
propagated by the Russian intelligence services, contends that Ukraine sought to help Hillary Clinton and harm then candidate
Let's not play
Trump,
games. They both
and
did.
that a computer server providing this fiction is hidden somewhere in
Oh,
Ukraine.
he's already impeached.
That is the so-called
He's already
CrowdStrike
impeached.
conspiracy theory.
What they're trying to figure out
This
if they're
tale
going to
is
remove
also
him, but he's already
patently
impeached.
false. And remarkably, it is precisely the
He's the
inverse
third
of what the
president in
US
American history
intelligence
to be
community's
impeached. Now we're
unanimous
trying to see if
assessment
he's going to get
was
removed.
that Russia interfered in the 2016 election in sweeping and systemic fashion in order to hurt Hillary Clinton and help Donald Trump. Nevertheless, the president evidently believed that a public announcement lending credence to these allegations by the Ukrainian president could assist his reelection by putting to rest any doubts Americans may have had over the legitimacy of his first election, even as he invited foreign interference in the next. To the degree that most Americans have followed the president's efforts to involve another foreign power in our election, they may be most familiar with his entreaty to the Ukrainian president on the now infamous July 25th call to
These live pictures
do
out
us
of
a favor
Beirut, though, are pretty
and
intense
investigate
right
Biden
now.
and the 2016
As you can see.
conspiracy theory.
What's
But
up,
that
everybody?
call was not the beginning of the story of the president's corrupt scheme, nor was it the end. Rather, it was merely part,
Go off camera
although
for
a
a second.
significant part, of a months-long effort by President Trump and his allies and associates who applied significant and increasing pressure on Ukraine
Yes,
to
we
announce
are
these
listening
two
to
politically motivated investigations.
Adam Schiff
Key
talk.
figures in the Trump administration were aware
Live
or
right
directly
now.
involved or participated in the scheme. As we saw yesterday, one witness, a $1 million donor to the president's inaugural committee, put it this way: everyone was in the loop. After twice inviting Ukraine's new president to
What
the
you're
White
looking at right
House
now is live
without
pictures from
providing a
Beirut,
specific date for the proposed visit,
where protests have been going
President
on.
Trump conditioned this coveted head of state meeting on the announcement of these sham investigations. For Ukraine's new and untested leader, an official meeting with the President of the United States in the Oval Office was critical. It would help bestow on him important domestic and international legitimacy as he sought to implement an ambitious anti-corruption platform. Actual and apparent support from the President of the United States would also strengthen his position as he sought to negotiate a peace agreement with Russia's President Vladimir Putin, seeking an end to Russia's illegal annexation and continued military occupation of parts of Ukraine. But most pernicious, President Trump conditioned hundreds of millions of dollars in congressionally appropriated, taxpayer-funded military assistance for the same purpose, to apply more pressure on Ukraine's leader to announce the investigations. This military aid, which has long enjoyed bipartisan support, was designed to help Ukraine defend itself from the Kremlin's aggression. More than 15,000 Ukrainians have died fighting Russian forces and their proxies. 15,000. And the military aid was for such essentials as sniper rifles, rocket-propelled grenade launchers, radar, night vision goggles, and other vital support for the war effort. Most critically, the military aid that we provide Ukraine helps to protect and advance American national security interests in the region and beyond. America has an abiding interest in stemming Russian expansionism and resisting any nation's efforts to remake the map of Europe by dint of military force, even as we have tens of thousands of troops stationed there. Moreover, as one witness put it during our impeachment inquiry, the United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here. Now, when the president's scheme was exposed and the House of Representatives properly performed its constitutional
What's up,
responsibility
everybody? I hope you all are
to
well
investigate
today.
the matter, President Trump used the same
It is
unrivaled authority
Wednesday,
at his disposal as Commander-in-Chief
January
to cover up
22nd.
his wrongdoing.
We're watching live
In unprecedented
protests in
fashion, the
Beirut,
President ordered the entire
well as
executive branch of the United States of America to
lead House
categorically
impeachment
refuse
manager Adam
and
Schiff.
completely obstruct the House's impeachment investigation. Such a wholesale obstruction of congressional impeachment has never
That's what we're
before
doing.
occurred in our democracy. And it represents one of the most blatant efforts at a cover-up in history. If not remedied by his conviction in the Senate and removal from office, President Trump's abuse of his office and obstruction of Congress will permanently alter
They
the
still have
balance of
Christmas
power
stuff
among the
up there?
branches of government,
It's crazy.
inviting future presidents to operate as if they are also beyond the reach of accountability, congressional
That is
oversight,
crazy.
and the law. On the basis of this egregious misconduct, the House of Representatives returned 2 articles of impeachment against the president. First, charging that President Trump corruptly abused the powers of the presidency to solicit foreign
It's
interference
a lot of police right there.
in the upcoming presidential election for his personal political benefit. And second, that President Trump obstructed an impeachment inquiry into that abuse of power in order to cover up his misconduct. The House did not take this extraordinary step lightly.
So I guess they're
As we will discuss, impeachment
Oh.
exists for cases in which the conduct of the president rises beyond mere policies.
I can't tell if that's the police or if those are
and without
those are
urgency
fireworks
at the
from
ballot
people.
box. Instead, we are here today to
Those are
consider a
fireworks from
much
people.
more grave matter, and that is an attempt to use the powers of the presidency to cheat in an election. For precisely this reason, the president's misconduct cannot be decided at the ballot box, for we cannot be assured that the vote will be
It's a
fairly
decent
won.
amount of police right there.
In corruptly using his office to gain a political advantage, in abusing the powers of that office in such a way to jeopardize our national security and the integrity of our elections, in obstructing the investigation into
go
his
back to
own
both screens.
wrongdoing, the president has shown that he believes that he's above the law and scornful of constraint. As we saw yesterday on the screen, that under Article 2, he can do anything he wants. Moreover, given the seriousness of the conduct at issue and its persistence, this matter cannot and must not be decided by the courts, which, apart from the presence of the Chief Justice here today, are given no role in impeachments in either the House or the Senate. Being drawn into litigation taking many months or years to complete would provide the president with an opportunity to continue his misconduct. He would remain secure in the knowledge that he may tie up the Congress in the courts indefinitely, as he has with Don McGahn, rendering the impeachment power effectively meaningless. We also took this step with the knowledge that this was not the first time the president solicited foreign interference in our elections. In 2016, then candidate Trump implored Russia to hack his opponent's email account, something that the Russian military agency did only hours later. Only hours later. When the president said, "Hey, Russia, if you're listening," they were listening. Only hours later, they hacked his opponent's campaign. And the president has made it clear this will also not be the last time. Asking China only recently to join Ukraine in investigating his political opponent.
China.
Over the coming days, we will present to you and to the American people the extensive evidence collected during the House's impeachment inquiry
Oh, please.
into the president's abuse of
Can't
power.
wait.
Overwhelming evidence. Notwithstanding his unprecedented and wholesale obstruction of the investigation into that misconduct. You will hear and read testimony from courageous public servants who upheld their oath to the Constitution and their legal obligations to comply with congressional action despite a categorical order by
I wonder how
President
many
Trump
protesters are
not
still
to
out there.
cooperate with the impeachment inquiry.
You can't really see. That's a nice little fire going.
These are courageous Americans who were told by the President of the United States not to cooperate, not to appear,
Some nice fires
not
going
to
right there.
testify, but who had the sense of duty to do so. But more than that,
Yo, those lasers
you will
are
hear
so
from
dope,
witnesses
though.
who have not
Not
yet
gonna lie.
testified, like John Bolton, and Mick Mulvaney, Mr. Blair, and Mr. Duffy. And if you can believe the President's words last month, you will also hear from Secretary Pompeo. You will hear their testimony at the same time as the American people. That is, if you allow it, if we have a fair trial. During our presentation, you will see documentary records. Those the President was unable to suppress, that expose the President's scheme in detail. You will learn of further evidence that has been revealed in the days since the House voted to impeach President Trump, even as the President and his agents have persisted in their efforts to cover up their wrongdoing from Congress and the public. And you will see dozens of new documents providing new and critical evidence of the President's guilt that remain at this time in the President's hands and in the hands of the Department of Defense and the Department of State and the Office of Management and Budget, even the White House. You will see them, and so will the American people, if you allow it. If, in the name of a fair trial, you will demand it. These are politically charged times. Tempers can run high, particularly where this president is concerned. But these are not unique times. Deep divisions and disagreements were hardly alien concepts to the framers. So they designed the impeachment power in such a way as to insulate it as best they could from the crush of partisan politics. The framers placed the question of removal before the United States Senate, a body able to rise above the fray, to soberly judge the president's conduct or misconduct for what it was, nothing more and nothing less. In Federalist 65, Hamilton wrote, "Where else than in the Senate could have been found a tribunal sufficiently dignified or sufficiently independent? What other body would be likely to feel confidence enough in its own situation to preserve unawed and uninfluenced the necessary impartiality between an individual accused and the representatives of the people, his accuser?" It is up to you to be the tribunal that Hamilton envisioned. It is up to you to show the American people and yourselves that his confidence and that of the other founders was rightly placed. The Constitution entrusts you to the responsibility of acting as impartial jurors, to hold a fair and thorough trial and to weigh the evidence before you, no matter what your party affiliation or your vote in the previous election or the next. Our duty is to the Constitution and to the rule of law. I recognize there will be times during the trial that you may long to return to the business of the Senate. The American people look forward to the
They're
same.
throwing shit at police.
but not before you decide what kind of democracy that
For
you
sure.
believe we ought to be. And what the American people have a right to
Oh.
expect
That's
in the
some tear
conduct
gas
of
right
their
there.
president. The House believes that an impartial juror, upon hearing the evidence that the managers will lay out in the coming days, will find that the Constitution demands the removal of Donald J. Trump from his office as President of the United States. But that will be for you to decide. With the weight of history upon you, and as President Kennedy once said, a good conscience your only sure reward. In drafting our Constitution, the framers designed a new and untested form of government. It would be based on free and fair elections to ensure that our political leaders would be chosen democratically and by citizens of our country alone. Having broken free from a king with unbridled authority who often placed his own interests above that of the people, the framers established a structure that would guarantee that the chief executive's power flowed only from his obligation to the people, rather than from a sovereign whose power was conferred on him by divine right. In this new architecture, no branch of government or individual would predominate over another. In this way, the founders ensured that their elected leaders and their president would use the powers of office only to undertake that which the people desired, and not for their personal aggrandizement or enrichment. What did those who rebelled and fought a revolution desire? No different than what we, the generations that have followed, desire. That no person, including and especially the president, would be above the law. Nothing could be more dangerous to a democracy than a commander-in-chief who believed that he could operate with impunity, free from accountability. Nothing, that is, except a Congress that is willing to let it be so. To ensure that no such threat could take root and subvert our fledgling democracy, the framers divided power among three co-equal branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches, so that ambition may be made to counter ambition. They provided for presidential elections every 4 years, and the framers required that the president swear an oath
What's up,
to
Ashton?
faithfully execute the law and to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution
What's good?
of the
How are
United
you?
States. Even with these guardrails in place, the framers understood that an individual could come to power who defied that solemn oath, who pursued his own interests rather than those of the country he led. For that reason, the framers adopted a tool used by the British Parliament to constrain its officials: the power of impeachment.
So these are live pictures
Rather
of
than a
Beirut
mechanism to overturn an election,
There's
impeachment
protests
would be a remedy of
going
last
on,
resort.
as well as
And unlike in England, the
Capitol
framers
Hill.
applied this ultimate check to the highest office in the land, to the President of the United States. Impeachment and removal of a duly elected president was not intended for policy disputes or poor administration of the state. Instead, the framers had in mind the most serious of offenses, those against the public itself. Hamilton explained that impeachment was not designed
She's
to
feeling
cover
better.
only statutory or
I'm
common
pretty
law
good.
crimes,
Ashton can't
but
complain.
instead
You know.
crimes against the body politic. Hamilton wrote, "The
Thanks for
subjects of its
asking.
jurisdiction are those offenses which proceed
Miss you too so
from the
much. Oh,
misconduct
you're
of
amazing,
public men.
Ashton.
or in
Well,
other words, from the abuse
I'm here
or
twitching it
violation of some
and
public trust.
you now in it. So
They are of a nature
catch me.
which may with peculiar propriety be denominated political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to society itself. In other words, impeachment would be confined to abuses of people's trust and to the society itself. This is precisely the abuse that has been undertaken by our current president when he withheld money in support for an ally at war to secure a
But
political
yeah, I'm here.
benefit.
I'm
The
floating
punishment
around.
for those crimes would fit the political nature of the offense. As James Wilson, a delegate at the Constitutional Convention and a future Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, reasoned, impeachments are confined to political characters, to political crimes and misdemeanors, and to political punishments. That punishment,
go,
the framers
moving up.
determined, would be neither prison nor fines, but instead limited to removal from office and disqualification
Yeah, I'm using them all.
from holding
actually.
future office. The
Doing
framers
it all.
chose to undertake impeachment for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors to underscore the requirement of an offense against society. In this phrase, high modifies both the crimes and the misdemeanors, in that both relate to
So
a
yeah, I
high
haven't like
injustice,
really taken a break. Like
transgression committed
maybe
against
1 or 2
the
days
people.
I took off, but like really
to
like
the
I've been
public.
just moving around platforms trying to see what's up.
The
You know,
framers had two broad
trying to do a
categories
whole
in
bunch of
mind.
different things.
Those actions that are
I was over on
facially
You Now last night.
permissible
I'm
under the
here right
president's
now.
authority, but are
I'll
based
be here
on
for most of the
corrupt
day.
motives,
I do got to
such as
do
seeking to
the
obtain a personal
morning
benefit
show
from
with
public
Ryan on
office.
Twitch.
And
In
those that far
an
exceed
hour,
the president's
then I'll be back
constitutional
on here
authority
probably,
or violate
chilling.
the legal limits on that authority. In Article 1, we deal with the first evil, which the framers wish to guard against, that is, cases in which a president corruptly misused the power otherwise bestowed on him to secure a personal reward. Guarding against the president who undertakes official acts with the corrupt motive of helping himself is at the heart
Yeah, it's all good. Well, I'm all
of the
over.
impeachment power.
Is that a tank?
As one scholar explained, the president's duty to faithfully execute the law requires that he undertakes
looks like a
actions
tank.
only when motivated in the public interest rather than in their private self-interest. Efforts to withhold official acts for personal gain countermand the president's sacred oath and therefore constitute impeachable behavior as it was conceived of by the framers. In Article 2, we also deal with a second evil contemplated by the founders, who made it clear that the president ought not operate beyond the limits placed on him by legislative and judicial branches. Impeachment was warranted for a president who usurped the power of the Constitution that was not granted to him, such as to defy Congress the right to determine the propriety, the scope, and the nature
Still a lot of
an
flashbangs and
impeachment
stuff
inquiry
going
into
on.
his own misconduct. The framers fashioned a powerful chief executive, but not one beyond accountability of law. When a president wields power in ways that are inappropriate and seek to distinguish the rights of the Congress, he exceeds the power of his constitutional authority and violates the limits placed on his conduct. Obstruction of a separate and co-equal branch of government for the purposes of covering abuse of power not only implies a corrupt intent, but also demonstrates a remarkable antipathy towards the balance of power contemplated and enshrined in our Constitution. It is a betrayal of the president's sacred oath of office and of his duty to put the country before
That was
himself.
a lot right there. Holy.
On September 24th, 2019, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi announced that the House of Representatives would move forward.
I haven't kept
with an
up on
official
with
impeachment
anything on
inquiry
him.
into President
This
Donald
is
J.
the second day of
The
the
announcement followed
Senate
public
trial.
reporting in the United
and,
States and Ukraine
This is the first
that the
part
president
where
and his agents sought Ukraine's help
the
in his
House
re-election effort.
managers
And
try and make their
revelations that the
case,
White
but
House was
this
blocking
is
from
pretty
Congress
nuts right
an
now
intelligence
in
community
Beirut.
whistleblower complaint possibly related to this grave offense.
Basically throwing fireworks
The
right
next
at the
day, on
police.
September
That is
25th,
basically a tank, isn't it?
Under extraordinary pressure, the White House released publicly the record of the July 25th call between President Trump
It's crazy.
and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. The call record revealed that President Trump explicitly requested that the new leader undertake investigations beneficial to President Trump's re-election campaign. Upon release of the record of the call, President Trump claimed that the call was perfect. Far from perfect, the call record revealed a president who used his high office to personally and directly press the leader of a foreign country to do his political dirty work. Asking for a favor, President Trump insisted that President Zelensky investigate a formidable potential political opponent,
Dang,
former
it's a
Vice
mess there.
President
Yeah,
Joe
it's pretty
Biden,
bad right now.
as well as the baseless conspiracy theory that Ukraine, not Russia,
It's pretty
interfered in
bad
the
there right now,
2016
for
election
sure.
to assist then-candidate Trump's opponent. Witnesses who listened to the call as it transpired testified that they immediately recognized these requests did not represent official U.S. policy and instead were politically charged appeals not appropriate for a president to make. Key witnesses emphasized it was not necessary that Ukraine actually undertake the investigations, only that the Ukrainian president announce them. President Trump's objective was not to encourage a foreign government to investigate legitimate allegations of misconduct or wrongdoing abroad, made clear as well by the fact that the investigations he wanted announced have been discredited entirely. Rather, the president simply wanted to reap a political benefit by tarnishing a political rival and attempting to erase from history his previous election misconduct. To compel the Ukrainian president to do his political dirty work, President Trump withheld from President Zelensky two official acts of great importance: that coveted White House meeting, to which the President Zelensky had already been invited, and $391 million in military assistance Ukraine needed to fight the Russians. For a strategic partner of the United States in a hot war with Russian-backed forces inside its own borders, the symbolic support conferred on it by an Oval Office visit with the President of the United States and the life-saving support of our military aid was essential. As the House's presentation will make clear, in directly soliciting foreign interference and withholding those official acts in exchange for the announcement of political investigations beneficial to his
I
reelection,
want to see how big these
the
crowds are,
president put
because
his
all you
own
really
interests
see is like
above
behind the
the national
police
interest.
line.
President Trump undermined the integrity of our free and fair elections by pressing a foreign power to influence our most sacred right as citizens, our right to freely choose our leaders. And he threatened our national security by withholding critical
What's
aid
up,
from
Ashton?
a partner on the front lines of war with Russia, an aggressor that has threatened peace and
What's up,
stability
what's
on
up?
an entire continent. In so doing, the president sacrificed not only the security of our European allies, but also our nation's core
It's a lot of
national
cops.
security interests. President Trump undertook this pressure campaign through hand-picked agents inside and outside of government who circumvented traditional policy channels. President Trump intentionally bypassed many U.S. government career officials
Bless
with
you, Doc.
responsibility over Ukraine and advanced his scheme primarily
We're not, like,
through the
glitching or
effort of his
anything, right?
personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani. President Trump carried out this scheme with the knowledge of senior administration officials, including the president's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, Secretary of
Alright,
State
man.
Mike Pompeo, Vice President Mike Pence, National Security Council Legal Advisor John Eisenberg, and White House counsel Pat Cipollone. When the president became aware that the scheme would be
Nah, you
uncovered,
good?
he
Sweet.
undertook an unprecedented effort to obstruct the House of Representatives' impeachment inquiry and to hide it
Sweet.
from the public and from Congress, including all evidence related to his misconduct. That cover-up continues today, as the administration has not provided a single document pursuant to lawful subpoenas by the House. Administration also continues to prevent witnesses from cooperating, further obstructing the House, efforts the president is no doubt proud of, but which threaten the integrity of this institution, of this Congress as a co-equal branch of power. Our ability not only to do oversight, but to hold a president who is unindictable accountable. But despite these efforts to obstruct our inquiry, the House of
All right, hold
Representatives
on.
uncovered overwhelming evidence related to the president's misconduct
Hold on real quick.
through interviews with 17 witnesses who appeared before the Intelligence, Oversight
I'm
and
working on
Reform
something.
and Foreign Affairs committees. Many of these witnesses bravely defied White House orders not to comply with duly authorized congressional subpoenas. And were it not for them, were it not
Hold
for
on 1 second.
Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, who was the first through the breach, we may never have known of the president's scheme. I want you to imagine just for a minute what kind of courage that took. For Ambassador Yovanovitch, the subject of that vicious smear campaign, to to risk her reputation and her career to stand up to the President of the United States, who's instructing her through his agents, you will not cooperate. You will not testify. You will tell them nothing. Or Bill Taylor, West Point graduate, Vietnam veteran, the Bronze Star, and something he was even more proud of, the Combat Infantryman's badge. He knows what courage is. He showed a different kind of courage in Vietnam, but he also showed courage, as did others, in coming forward, in defying the president's order that he obstruct, to tell the American people what he wanted. But for the courage of people like this, and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman of Purple Heart recipient, but for their courage, we would have known nothing of the president's misconduct. Nothing. When
These are two different angles
directs his
of Lebanon.
ire towards these people, this is why. Because they showed the courage to come forward.
Two different angles of Lebanon here.
Now, we held in the Intelligence Committee 7 open hearings with 12 fact witnesses. Separately, the Judiciary Committee held public hearings with constitutional law experts and counsel from the House Intelligence Committee as it sought to determine whether to draft and consider articles of impeachment. The House also collected text messages related to the president's scheme from a witness who provided limited personal communications. Since the conclusion of our inquiry, new evidence has continued to come to light through court-ordered releases of administration documents and public reporting, underscoring that there is significantly more evidence of the president's guilt, which he continues to block from Congress, including the Senate. Nevertheless, the documents and testimony that we were able to collect paints an overwhelming and damning picture of the president's efforts to use the powers of his office
I
to
still need to get a
corruptly solicit
hoodie.
foreign help in his re-election
Maybe lit.
campaign,
How's the weather in New York?
and
Freezing.
withhold official acts
been
and
cold as
military
fuck.
aid to compel that support.
But
Over the coming days, you will
it is
hear
what it is.
remarkably consistent evidence of President Trump's corrupt
It is
scheme
what
and
it is.
When you focus on the evidence uncovered during the investigation, you will appreciate there is no serious dispute about the facts underlying the president's conduct.
Two different angles of
And this is
Beirut
why
right now. Beirut, Lebanon.
you will hear the president's lawyers make the astounding claim that you can't impeach a president for abusing the powers of his office, because they can't seriously contest that that is exactly what he did. And so they must go find a lawyer somewhere. Apparently, they could not go to their own attorney general, who was just reported in a memo he wrote as part of the audition for attorney general, which opined that a president can be
Same
impeached
here,
for
yeah.
abusing
It's been like,
trust.
I think it's
Couldn't go
only
to
like
Bill Barr for that
25 right
opinion.
now.
Couldn't go to even Jonathan
like that,
Turley,
it's
their expert
freezing
in
out.
the House, for that opinion. No.
It is
Had to go
absolutely
outside of
freezing
these
out.
Experts outside of the constitutional law to a criminal defense lawyer and professor. And why? Because they can't contest the facts.
Oh, well, it is wintertime.
The president was the key player in the scheme. Everyone was in the loop. He
It is
directed
wintertime.
the actions of his team. He personally asked a foreign government to investigate his opponent. These facts are not in dispute. Ultimately, the question for you is whether the president's undisputed actions require the removal of the 45th president of the United States from office. Because
I
he
am the
abused his
great
office
Cornholio,
trust
and I
by
need
using
tipi
his
for my
power
bunghole.
for personal gain, by seeking illicit foreign
What's up, Red
assistance in
Dragon?
his
What's poppin',
re-election
bruh?
and covering it up.
What's goody, man?
Other than voting on whether to send our men and women to war, there is, I think, no greater responsibility before you than the one before you now.
I am the
Note that we
great
take into
Cornholio.
impartially weigh the facts and evidence, requires serious and objective
I need
consideration.
teepee.
Decisions
For my
that are
bunghole.
about country, not party, about the Constitution, not politics, about what is right and what is wrong. After you consider the evidence and weigh your oath to render a fair and impartial verdict, I suggest to you today the only conclusion consistent with the facts and law, not just the law but the Constitution, is clear, as described by a constitutional law expert's testimony before the House. If this conduct is not impeachable, then nothing is. Let me take a moment to describe to you how we intend to present the case over the coming days. Today, you will hear the details of the President's corrupt scheme in narrative form, illustrating the timeline
Not much, man. That's
of the
what's
effort
popping,
through
bro.
the testimony of numerous witnesses
feel you.
who came before the House, as
Feel
well as
you,
the
man.
documents
Is
and
this
materials
gonna
we
come back
collected
up,
as
or what's
evidence
up
during the
here?
investigation. After you hear the factual chronology,
Is this
we
gonna
will
come
then
back
discuss
up?
the
or what's
constitutional
up here?
framework of impeachment as it was envisioned by the founders. Before we analyze how the facts of the President's misconduct and cover-up lead to the conclusion that the President undertook the sort of corrupt course of conduct that impeachment was intended to remedy.
Now they doing it at Applebee's too. All you can
Let me
eat.
start with a preview of the President's scheme, the details of which you'll hear during the course
They all
of
steal
this
from
day.
each other.
President Trump's
We still have
months-long
boneless wings upstairs.
scheme to extract
Oh, I know,
help in
I
his
know.
2020 re-election
I'm doing that.
campaign from the new Ukrainian president involved an effort
I'm
to
doing the
solicit
juice
and then
cleanse.
compel the new leader to announce political investigations.
I got to. My stomach has been
The
killing me.
announcement would reference
For, like,
two
days.
specific investigations.
Gotta do something.
One was intended to undermine the
Damn, that's
unanimous
crazy how that light is like all
consensus
blue
of our
under it,
intelligence
wherever the hell this
agencies.
guy's standing.
Congress and Special Counsel Robert Mueller that Russia interfered in the 2016 election to help then candidate Trump, and another to hurt the presidency of former Vice President Joe Biden. The Kremlin itself has been responsible for first
Oh.
propagating one of the two false narratives that the president desired. In February 2017, less than a month after the U.S. intelligence community released its assessment that Russia alone was responsible for a covert influence campaign designed to help President Trump win the 2016 election, President Putin said, as we all know, during the presidential campaign in the United States, the Ukrainian government adopted a unilateral position in favor of one of the candidates, in favor of one candidate.
I am
More than
the
that, certain
great
oligarchs,
Cornholio.
certainly with the approval of political leadership, funded this candidate, or female candidate to be more
Deepy.
precise. Those were Putin's words, February 2nd, 2017. Of course, this is false, and is part of a Russian counter-narrative that President Trump and some of his allies have adopted. Fiona Hill, Senior Director for Europe and Russia at the National Security Council, described Russia's effort to promote this baseless theory.
Based on questions and statements I've heard, some of you on this committee appear to believe that Russia and its security services did not conduct a campaign against our country, and that perhaps, somehow, for some reason, Ukraine did. This is a fictional narrative that has been perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services themselves. The unfortunate truth is that Russia was the foreign power that systematically attacked our democratic institutions in 2016. This is the public conclusion of our intelligence agencies, confirmed in bipartisan congressional reports. It is beyond dispute, even if some of the underlying details must remain classified.
This, of course, was not the first time that President Trump embraced Russian activity and disinformation.
One thing
On
I've
July
noticed about this,
24
like,
last year,
this
Special
Senate
Counsel
trial is
Robert
Trump
Mueller
doesn't
testified
tweet during
before
it at
Congress
all.
That Russia
For like
interfered
12
in the
hours, he
2016
like, didn't tweet
election
at all. I was
in a
like, holy shit,
quote,
how is this
sweeping and
possible?
systemic fashion to benefit Donald
Ah, I
Trump's
spoke
political
too soon. He
campaign.
just tweeted.
Mueller and his team found that, quote, the Russian government
Just
perceived
now.
that it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome. They also found that the Trump campaign expected it would benefit electorally from
Just
information
now.
stolen and released through Russian efforts. And just as he solicited help from Ukraine in 2019, in 2016, then candidate Trump also solicited help from Russia in his election effort. As you will recall, at a rally in Florida, he said the following.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press. Let's see if that happens.
Following Special Counsel Mueller's testimony, during which he warned against future interference in our elections, did the president recognize the threat posed to our democracy and renounce Russian interference in our democracy? Did he choose to stand with his own intelligence agencies, both houses of Congress, and the special counsel's investigation in affirming that Russia interfered in our last election? He did not. Instead, only one day after special counsel Mueller testified before Congress, empowered in the belief that he had evaded accountability for making use of foreign support in our last election, President Trump was on the phone with the president of Ukraine, pressing him to intervene on President Trump's behalf in the next election. Let's take a moment to let that sink in. July 24th, Bob Mueller concludes a lengthy investigation. He comes before the Congress. He testifies that Russia systemically interfered in our election to help elect Donald Trump, that the campaign understood that and they willfully made use of that help. July 24th, that's what happens. The very next day, he's on the phone, President Trump is on the phone with a different foreign power, this time Ukraine, trying to get Ukraine to interfere in the next election, the next day. That should tell us something. That should tell us something. He did not feel shamed by what the special counsel found. He did not feel deterred by what the special counsel found. He felt emboldened by escaping accountability. For the very next day, he's on the phone soliciting foreign interference again. Now, that July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky was a key part of President Trump's direct and corrupt solicitation of foreign help in the 2020 election. The request likely sounded familiar to President Zelensky, who had been swept into office in a landslide victory on a campaign of rooting out just the type of corruption he was being asked to undertake on this call with our president. Zelensky campaigned as a reformer, as someone outside of politics who would come up and clean up corruption, who would end the political prosecutions, end the political investigations, and what is his most important and powerful patron asking him to do exactly what he campaigned against. No wonder he resisted this pressure campaign. Now, President Trump had been provided talking points for discussion by the National Security Council staff beforehand, including recommendations to encourage President Zelensky to continue to promote anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine. So the National Security staff understood what was in the U.S. national security interests, and that was rooting out corruption. And they encouraged the president to talk about it. But as you see from the record of the call, and I joined the president saying, read the call, that topic was never addressed. The word corruption never escapes his lips. Instead, President Trump openly pressed President Zelensky to pursue the two investigations that would benefit him personally. In response to President Zelensky's gratitude for the significant military support the United States has provided to Ukraine, President Trump said, I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot, and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people, the server. They say Ukraine has it. That's that crazy conspiracy theory I talked about earlier, that there's this server somewhere in Ukraine that shows that, in fact, it was Ukraine that hacked the DNC, not the Russians. That's a Russian propaganda conspiracy theory, and here it is being promulgated by the President of the United States, and more than promulgated, he's pressuring an ally to further this Russian propaganda. Because he was referring to this extensively discredited conspiracy theory that Ukraine was the one who really hacked the DNC, the Democratic National Committee servers, in 2016. And that reference to CrowdStrike, well, that's an American cybersecurity firm. And the theory, this kooky conspiracy theory, is that CrowdStrike moved the DNC servers to Ukraine to prevent U.S. law enforcement.
Sorry, I really had to
from
stretch my back. Like bad.
If Ukraine announced
So,
an investigation
I
into
just
this
did that.
fabrication, President Trump would remove what he
Just, like,
perceived to
laying
be
on
a
the
cloud
floor.
over his legitimacy, the legitimacy of his
Gonna
last
crack it
election,
and shit.
Russia's assistance with his
good.
campaign, and suggest that it was the Democratic Party that was the real beneficiary of help. On the call, President
Looks like
Trump
a party
told
down that
Zelensky,
street.
whatever you can do, it's very important that you do it if that's possible. President Zelensky agreed that he would do the investigation, saying,
Yo,
yes,
blue laser looks
it is very
sick,
important for me, and everything that you just mentioned earlier. President Trump then turned to his second request, asking
What up,
President
Sid?
Zelensky to look into the sham allegation into
What's
former
good?
Vice President Biden. President Trump said to President Zelensky, the other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution. And a lot of people want to find out about that, so whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you could look into it, it sounds horrible to me. There is no question that President Trump intended in pressing the Ukraine leader to look into his political rival. Even after the impeachment inquiry began, he confirmed his desire on the South Lawn of the White House, declaring not only that Ukraine should investigate Biden, but that China should do the same. Let's see what he said.
What exactly did you hope Zelensky would do about the Bidens after your phone call? Exactly.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer. They should investigate the Bidens, because how does a company that's newly formed, and all these companies, if you look at, and by the way, likewise, China should start an investigation into the Bidens, because what happened in China is just about as bad as what happened with Ukraine.
I hear you.
Now, the day after that July 25th phone call, President Trump sought confirmation that President Zelensky understood his request to announce the politically motivated investigations and that he would follow through. After meeting with Ukrainian officials, President Zelensky and his top aide, the president's hand-picked ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, called President Trump from an outdoor restaurant in Kiev to report back. This was the second conversation between the two about Ukraine in as many days. David Holmes, an American diplomat dining with Sondland, overheard the call, including the president's voice through the cell phone. I described part of that call last night. Holmes testified that President Trump asked Sondland, so he's going to do the investigation? Sondland replied that he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to. After the phone call, Holmes took the opportunity to ask Ambassador Sondland for his candid impression of the president's views on Ukraine. According to Holmes,
in particular, I asked Ambassador Sondland if it was true that the president did not give an expletive about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland agreed that the president did not give an expletive about Ukraine. I asked why not. Ambassador Sondland stated that the president only cares about big stuff. I I noted there was big stuff going on in Ukraine, like a war with Russia. And Ambassador Sondland replied that he meant big stuff that benefits the president, like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani was pushing. The conversation then moved on to other topics.
Those 3 days in July, the 24th, the 25th, and the 26th, reveal a lot about President Trump's effort to solicit help from a foreign country in assisting his own re-election. On the 24th, Special Counsel Mueller testifies that Russia interfered in our 2016 election to assist the Trump campaign, which knew about the interference, welcomed it, and utilized it. That's the 24th. 25th is the day of the call, when President Trump, believing he'd escaped accountability for Russian meddling in the first election and his welcoming of it, asked the Ukrainian president to help him undermine the special counsel's conclusion and help him smear a political opponent, former Vice President Biden. And then the third day in a row in July, President Trump sought to ensure that Ukraine had received his request and understood it and would take the necessary steps to announce the investigations that he wanted. 3 days in July. In many ways, those 3 days in July tell so much of the story. This course of conduct alone should astound all of us who value the sanctity of our elections and who understand that the vast powers of the presidency are reserved only for actions which benefit the country as a whole, rather than the political fortunes of any one individual. President Trump's effort to use an official head of state phone call to solicit the announcement of investigations helpful to his re-election is not only conduct unbecoming a president, but it is conduct of one who believes that the powers of his high office are political tools to be wielded against his opponents, including by asking a foreign government to investigate a United States citizen and for a corrupt purpose. That alone is grounds for removal from office of the 45th president. But these 3 days in July were neither the beginning nor the end of this scheme. President Trump, acting through agents inside and outside of the U.S. government, including his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, sought to compel Ukraine to announce the investigations by withholding the head of state meeting in the Oval Office until the president of Ukraine complied. Hosting an Oval Office meeting for a foreign leader is an official act available only to one person, the President of the United States. And it is an official act that President Trump had already offered to President Zelensky during their first phone call on April 21st and in a subsequent letter to the Ukrainian leader. Multiple witnesses testified about the importance of a White House meeting for Ukraine. For example, Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent explained that a White House meeting was very important for Ukrainians to demonstrate the strength of their relationship
Is that like smoke bombs on
Ukraine's
like the
strongest supporter.
highway there?
Dr.
That's what
Fiona
it looked
Hill
like.
of the National Security Council explained a White House
Back up to
meeting
the
would
police
supply
front
the
line.
new Ukrainian government with, quote, the legitimacy it needed, especially vis-a-vis the Russians. And that the Ukrainians viewed a White House meeting as a recognition of their legitimacy as a sovereign state. This White House meeting would also prove to be important for 3 hand-picked agents whom President Trump placed in charge of U.S.-Ukraine issues: Ambassador Sondland, Ambassador Volker, and Energy Secretary Rick Perry, the so-called 3 amigos. They hope to convince President Trump to hold an Oval Office meeting with Zelensky. During a meeting of the 3 amigos on May 23rd, President Trump told them that Ukraine had tried to take him down in 2016. He then directed them, talk to Rudy Giuliani about Ukraine. It was immediately clear that Giuliani, who was pursuing the discredited investigations in Ukraine on the president's behalf, was the key to unlocking an Oval Office meeting for President Zelensky. Giuliani by then had said publicly that he was actively pursuing investigations President Trump corruptly desired and planning a trip to Ukraine. Giuliani admitted, quote, "We're not meddling in an election, we're meddling in an investigation." On May 10, however, Giuliani canceled the trip to Ukraine to dig up dirt on former Vice President Biden and the 2016 conspiracy theory, just as President Zelensky won elections for the presidency and parliament. Faced with a choice between working with Giuliani to pursue an Oval Office meeting, understanding it meant taking part in a corrupt effort to secure the political investigations, or abandoning efforts to support our Ukrainian ally, the president's agents fell into line. They would pursue the White House meeting and explain to Ukraine that announcements of the investigations was the price of admission. As Ambassador Sondland made clear,
I know that members of this committee frequently frame these complicated issues in the form of a simple question: was there a quid pro quo? As I testified previously, with regard to the requested White House call and the White House meeting, the answer is yes.
I'll be right
this
back.
quid pro quo was negotiated between the president's agents, Rudy Giuliani, and Ukrainian officials throughout the summer of 2019 in numerous telephone calls, text messages, and meetings, including during a meeting hosted by then National Security Advisor John Bolton on July 10th. Near the end of that July 10th meeting, after the Ukrainians again raised the issue of a White House visit, Ambassador Sondland blurted out that there would be agreement for a White House meeting once the investigations began. At that point, Bolton immediately stiffened and abruptly ended the meeting. During a subsequent discussion that day, Sondland was even more explicit. Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman, a director for Europe and Ukraine on the National Security Council, testified that Sondland began to discuss the deliverable required to get the White House meeting, which Sondland specifically mentioned was investigation of the Bidens. This is again in that meeting in the White House with a Ukrainian delegation and an American delegation. Sondland explained in that meeting he had an agreement with Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, whereby President Zelensky would be granted the Oval Office meeting if he went forward with the investigations. After the meeting, Vindman's supervisor, Dr. Hill, reported back to Bolton, who told her to tell John Eisenberg, the National Security Council legal advisor, that he was not part of whatever drug deal Sondland and Mulvaney are cooking up on this. She reported her concerns, as did Vindman. It remains unclear what action, if any, Bolton or Eisenberg took once they were made aware of Mulvaney and Sondland's drug deal. Both refused to testify in our inquiry. However, Dr. Hill testified that she understood that Mr. Eisenberg informed Mr. Cipollone of her concerns about the drug deal. If this body is serious about a fair trial, one that is fair to the President and to the American people, we again urge you to allow the House to call both Eisenberg and Bolton, as well as other key witnesses with firsthand knowledge who refuse to testify before the House on the orders of the President. Additional testimony and documents are particularly important because, according to Sondland, everyone was in the loop when it came to the President's self-serving effort. In part relying on email excerpts, Sondland explained that the President's senior aides and cabinet officials knew that the White House meeting was predicated on Ukraine's announcement of the investigations beneficial to the President's political campaign. Hill characterized the quid pro quo succinctly.
But it struck me yesterday when you put up on the screen Ambassador Sondland's emails and who was on these emails, and he said, these are the people who need to know, that he was absolutely right, because he was being involved in a domestic political errand. And we were being involved in national security foreign policy, and those two things had just diverged.
In effect, President Zelensky was being drawn into this domestic political errand. He grew wary of becoming involved in another country's election and domestic affairs. Bill Taylor, the acting U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time, described a conversation he had with a senior aide to the Ukrainian leader. He said,
"Also, on July 20th, I had a phone conversation with Alexander Danylyuk, President Zelensky's national security advisor, who emphasized that President Zelensky did not want to be used as an instrument in a U.S. re-election campaign."
Remember that conversation when you hear counsel say that the Ukrainians felt no pressure to be involved in a U.S. re-election campaign. But that concern did not deter President Trump. In his conversation with Sondland shortly before the 25th of July call, the president made clear that he not only wanted Ukraine to do the investigations or announce them, but also a White House meeting would only be scheduled if President Zelensky confirmed these investigations. As Volker communicated to President Zelensky's top aide by text less than 30 minutes before the phone call between Trump and Zelensky, and again, we're talking about July 25th, in a text 30 minutes before the Trump-Zelensky phone call, here's what is said. With Volker texting Andrei Yermak, a top aide to President Zelensky, "Good lunch. Thanks. Heard from White House. Assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, quote, get to the bottom of what happened, unquote, in 2016, we will nail down date for visit to Washington. Good luck. See you tomorrow. Kurt." Well, those words couldn't be much clearer. Assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we'll nail down the visit to Washington. That's a text 30 minutes before that call. Counsel for the president would like you to think this is just about that call. You don't get to look outside the four corners of that call. They don't want you to look at the months that went into preparing for that call or the months of pressure that followed it. But you could just look at, right now, what happened 30 minutes before that call in this text message. Heard from White House, assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016. If you were wondering how it seemed that President Zelensky was aware of what he was going to be asked on that call, this is how you can tell. He was prepped. Of course he was prepped. And in fact, the missing reference in the call record to Burisma was a signal Colonel Vindman recognized that clearly he had been prepped for that call. Why else would the name of this particular energy company come up in that conversation? Well, President Zelensky clearly got the message. Toward the end of the call with President Trump, President Zelensky said, "I also want to thank you for your invitation to visit the United States, specifically Washington, D.C. On the other hand, I also wanted to ensure you that we will be very serious about the case and we will work on the investigation." Thank you for the invitation. On the other hand, I want to assure you that we will be very serious about the case and we will work on the investigation. President Zelensky clearly understood the quid pro quo for the White House meeting on July 25th. But his reticence to be used as a political pawn kept President Trump from moving forward with a promise to schedule the meeting. And so, the president and his agents pressed on. In August, Giuliani met with a top Ukrainian aide and made it clear that Ukraine must issue a public statement announcing the investigations in order to get the White House meeting. Fearful of getting involved in U.S. domestic politics and having entered office with a promise to clean up government and corruption, President Zelensky and his aides preferred a generic statement about investigations. But Giuliani insisted, no, the statement must include two specific investigations that would benefit President Trump. Let's look at a comparison between the statement the Ukrainians preferred and the one that Giuliani required. So on the left, and I will read it in case you can't see the screens, the draft, the Yermak draft, the Ukrainian draft, says we intend to initiate and complete a transparent and unbiased investigation of all available facts and episodes, which in turn will prevent the recurrence of this problem in the future. That's pretty generic. But here's the Giuliani, Volker, Sondland response. This is what had to be included. We intend to initiate and complete a transparent and unbiased investigation of all available facts and episodes. Up to that point, it's exactly the same until you get to including those involving Burisma and the 2016 U.S. elections. And then it goes back to the Ukrainian draft, which in turn will prevent the recurrence of this problem in the future. You can see in this such graphic evidence, Ukrainians did not want to do this. They didn't even want to mention this. Giuliani had to insist, no, we're not going to be satisfied with some generic statement. After all, I think we can see, this isn't about corruption. No, this isn't about announcing investigations to damage Biden and to promote this fiction about the last election. So here in these texts you see that Giuliani, Volker, and Sondland have added these references to Burisma, a thinly veiled reference to former Vice President Biden and the 2016 election. They wish to ensure the Ukrainians mentioned the sham investigations President Trump required. Now, the Ukrainians recoiled at the new statement, recognizing that releasing it would run directly counter to the anti-corruption platform that Zelensky campaigned on and would embroil them in U.S. election politics. As a result, Zelensky didn't get his White House meeting. He still hasn't gotten his White House meeting. Senators, witness testimony, text messages, emails, and the call record itself confirm a corrupt quid pro quo for the White House meeting, an official act available only to the President of the United States in exchange for the announcement of political investigations. The President and his allies have offered no explanation for this effort, except the President can abuse his office all he likes, and there's nothing you can do about it. Can't indict him, can't impeach him. That is because they cannot seriously dispute that President Trump corruptly used an official White House visit for a foreign leader to compel the Ukrainian president into helping him cheat in the next election. The White House meeting, of course, was not the only official act that President Trump conditioned on the announcement of investigations into Biden and the conspiracy theory meant to exonerate President Trump from Russians' interference on his behalf in the last election. In a far more draconian step, as we have discussed, the President withheld $391 million of military aid. Several weeks before this phone call with President Zelensky, but after Giuliani was already pressing Ukrainian officials to conduct the investigations his clients sought, President Trump ordered the hold on Ukraine's military aid. Significantly, this was after Congress had already been notified that most of it was prepared to be spent. Ukraine had met all of the critical conditions for anti-corruption and defense reforms in order to receive the funds. We conditioned the funds. They met the conditions. The funds were ready to go. At the time, and even today, witnesses uniformly testified that the order to hold the funding came without explanation to the foreign policy and national security officials responsible for Ukraine. The only message from the Office of Management and Budget was that the hold was implemented at the direction of the President. Since Russia's illegal incursion into Ukraine in 2014, the U.S. has maintained a bipartisan policy of delivering hundreds of millions of dollars of military aid to Ukraine each year, which several senators here have personally invested significant time and effort to ensure. And it was President Trump himself who originally authorized additional financial support for military assistance to Ukraine in 2017 and 2018, without reservation, making his abrupt decision to withhold assistance in 2019 without explanation, all the more surprising to those responsible for Ukraine policy. That confusion, however, would soon disappear. The president used the hold on military aid as leverage to pressure Ukraine to announce these investigations that he hoped would help his re-election campaign. The only difference between the prior years, when the president approved the aid without question, and the inexplicable aid on hold in 2019, was the emergence of Joe Biden as a potentially formidable obstacle to the president's re-election. These funds that the president withheld, these funds, they don't just benefit Ukraine, they benefit the security of the United States by ensuring that Ukraine is equipped to defend its own borders against Russian aggression. As Ambassador Taylor noted in his deposition, the United States provides Ukraine with radar and weapons and sniper rifles, communication that save lives. It makes Ukrainians more effective. It might even shorten the war. That's what our hope is, to show the Ukrainians can defend themselves. And the Russians, in the end, will say, okay, we're going to stop. That's in our interest. This isn't just about Ukraine or its national security. It's about our national security. This isn't charity. It's about our defense as much as Ukraine's. Ambassador Taylor also said that the American aid was a concrete demonstration of the United States' commitment to resist aggression and to defend freedom. That's what this country is supposed to be about, right? Resisting aggression, defending freedom, not exporting corrupt ideas. That's what we're supposed to be out, right? It was against this backdrop that American officials responsible for Ukraine policy sat in astonishment, according to Ambassador Taylor, when they learned about the hold. Officials immediately expressed concerns about the legality of President Trump's hold on assistance to Ukraine. Their concerns were well warranted, as the Government Accountability Office, which was just last night poo-pooed by the President's Counsel, well, that's just some institution of Congress. Right? They're going to be just inherently biased, right? Well, they're a nonpartisan organization that both parties have come to rely upon. But I'm not surprised they don't like the conclusion of the GAO, because the Defense Department warned them that this was going to be the conclusion, and that conclusion was the hold on aid was not only wrong, it was not only immoral, it was also illegal. It violated the law, a law that we passed so that presidents could not refuse to spend money that we allocated for the defense of others and for ourselves. The Impoundment Control Act prevents the president and other government officials from unilaterally making funding decisions when Congress has made its intent clear. In fact, the act exists precisely because of previous presidential abuses of Congress's power of the purse during the Nixon era. The nonpartisan GAO ruled that the hold on military aid was not only illegal, but that holding underscores the president's efforts to go to any lengths to ensure his own personal benefit, rather than take care that the laws be faithfully executed, as he swore he would do when he took his oath of office. Now, because of recent Freedom of Information Act responses and media reports, we now know additional details about how senior officials expressed serious reservations about the legality of the hold at the time. So this is not like some new surprise. This is not like something that just came out of the blue. Oh, an independent watchdog agency found this was illegal. No, they knew this was illegal at the time. These concerns were raised at the time. Certain individuals who may have further information about the hold have refused to testify at the president's direction, including his chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, his deputy, Robert Blair, OMB official Michael Duffy, all of them, defied congressional subpoenas. But were included in important email communications that have been made public only recently. As you know, these and many other categories of documents from the White House, Defense Department, OMB were subpoenaed by the House, and none was produced.
What's up, Rosie?
None, at the President's direction and through Mr. Cipollone's intervention. Although the investigation developed an overwhelming body of evidence that clearly proves that the President implemented this hold to pressure Ukraine to announce investigations, the full story behind the hold, the full and complete story, is within your power to request. As you consider the evidence we present to you, ask yourselves whether the documents and witnesses that have been denied by the President's complete and unprecedented obstruction could shed more light on this critical topic. You may agree with the House managers that the evidence of the President's withholding of military aid to coerce Ukraine is already supported by overwhelming evidence, and no further insight is necessary to convict the President. But if the President's lawyers attempt to contest these or other factual matters, you are left with no choice but to demand to hear from each witness with firsthand knowledge. A fair trial requires nothing less. Let's look at some of the evidence that we gather notwithstanding this obstruction. First, the President withheld the aid without explanation and against the advice of his own agencies, cabinet officials, national security experts, including Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Esper, Ambassador Bolton, and others. Only Mick Mulvaney, a central figure in this effort, reportedly supported the hold, and he told us why. During a press briefing, Mulvaney personally acknowledged that the hold was ordered as part of a quid pro quo designed to get Ukraine to undertake the investigation President Trump sought.
He did say that.
Second, the reason for the security assistance hold was undoubtedly on the President's mind during the telephone call with President Zelensky on July 25th. Near the beginning of their conversation, President Zelensky expresses gratitude for U.S. military assistance, noting the United States' quote, great support in the area of defense. Immediately after President Zelensky's reference to defense and military support, President Trump responded by saying, I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot, and Ukraine knows a lot about it. President Trump then proceeded to openly press Ukraine to conduct these investigations. Third, numerous officials were aware that President Trump was withholding the White House meeting until the Ukrainian president announced the investigations. That the president would ratchet up pressure on Ukraine to compel its action stunned Ukraine experts like Ambassador Taylor, but followed logically for those engaged in the president's corrupt scheme. Fourth, by the end of August, there was still no explanation for the hold, despite ongoing efforts from numerous officials to persuade the president to release the money. And the leverage of the White House meeting had not succeeded in coercing Ukraine to announce the investigations, providing the president and his agents every reason to use the most aggressive lever of influence, hundreds of millions of dollars of military support, to compel Ukraine to act. If they didn't feel pressure, they would have done it. They would have done it. But of course they did. Imagine if this country were dependent on a more powerful country for our defense. Imagine we were at war. Imagine we were waiting for weapons to defend ourselves. Something our framers could have understood. Imagine that we found ourselves in those circumstances and we couldn't get a meeting with our ally. Much to our astonishment, they were withholding aid from us. You think we'd feel pressure? Of course we would. The framers had common sense, and so must we. Are we to accept, well, the president said there was no quid pro quo? I guess that closes the case. In every courtroom in America, jurors, and I know you're not just jurors, I read the Clinton trial, you're jurors and judges. Jurors all over America are told you don't leave your common sense at the door. Well, we don't have to leave our common sense at the door here, too. 2 + 2 = 4. The aid is withheld. You're asking for it. We're asking for it. His own aides are asking for it. No one can get an explanation. Ukrainians can't get an explanation. All the Ukrainians get is, we want you to do these investigations. They're promised a White House meeting. They want a White House meeting. They need a White House meeting. They're going to be going into negotiations with Putin. They want to show strength. They can't get in the door. They see the Russian foreign minister get in the door of the White House. We see the photos of the president, the Russian foreign minister, or the ambassador. What a great time they're having, but no, the president of Ukraine, our ally, can't get in the door. They're not stupid. They know what's going on here. They're not stupid. That conversation I referenced yesterday when the Ukrainians threw it right back in our face. When Ambassador Volker said to his Ukrainian counterpart, you shouldn't investigate the former president, you shouldn't engage in those political investigations. Oh, the Ukrainian response was, you mean like the one you want us to do of the Bidens and the Clintons? They're not stupid. By the end of August, there was still no explanation for the hold, despite efforts by numerous people to seek the release of the funding. The leverage hadn't succeeded in getting the president in coercing Ukraine to announce the investigations, and so the aid was withheld. Two witnesses privy to this scheme testified that the only logical conclusion to reach about the president's continued hold on the aid was that it was intended to put more pressure on Ukraine to announce the investigations. As I said, they testified it was as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. We can do math, and more importantly, so can the Ukrainians, and maybe even more importantly than that, so can the Russians. Multiple senior officials, including President Trump himself, have confirmed this logical conclusion. On September 7th, Ambassador Sondland spoke directly to President Trump, who by that point was aware that a whistleblower complaint was circulating that alleged the contours of his scheme, and that Congress and the public were beginning to ask probing questions about the hold on aid, including whether the withholding of the aid
about to hop off here and
for
go
re-election
on
help.
you now in a little bit. So I'll talk to
During
you
that
later.
call, September 7th,